Hey, Dan, you ready for the holidays?
Yep, you betcha. Trees up, presents all wrapped, Christmas dinner menu planned. Hey, if you'll allow me a stupid question, but how do Indigenous people celebrate Christmas? Like, do you guys do all the same stuff we do?
Some do, some don't. Some just celebrate the winter solstice with food and family and so on.
But isn't there some Indigenous thing you guys do around December 25th?
Okay. All right. How's this? We call Christmas Junia Day, and we start with a 23-day feast. It starts on December 24th. We do sweat lodges every day during that period, usually from 3 a.m. to midnight. Then we fast from 5 p.m., and then it's a different feast item every day for 23 days.
Holy cow.
And then there's the bonfires. We have to keep a fire going for the entire time, no matter what the weather is. 23 days of fires, and it can never go out. The men and women who keep the fire, no one can be wearing any clothing whatsoever. No earthly belongings, including clothes, for any of our fire keepers.
Oh, that's incredible.
And then on the 23rd day, we sacrifice a beaver, if we can find one. But let me tell you, it's hard to come up with one at this time of year. So what we do is we send out all the 12-year-olds in our community to go out and catch them. It's an important rite of passage. It's a good year when we get a beaver and all the kids come back safe and sound.
This is the most incredible stuff I've ever heard. How come I've never heard about it before?
Well, truthfully, we like to keep our traditions very sacred, and that means we keep them very discreet. In fact, I really shouldn't be telling you any of this, and so I need you to just keep this to yourself.
Oh, done and done. Okay, well, I'm off for my very first Christmas break. You enjoy the 23 days of Junia
Day.
Junia Day, and we'll touch base after that's over.
Niigaan, can I ask you a quick question?
Go for it.
I just wanted to check. None of that is true, is it?
Not even a little bit. I just made it up for Dan's sake.
Don't you feel bad for having him on?
When I think back over the last 500 or so years, I'm kind of okay with it, if you know what I mean.
Yup. Well played, mate. The Winnipeg Free Press proudly presents, in partnership with CJNU 93.7 FM, Niigaan and the Lone Ranger. Here are your hosts, Niigaan Sinclair and Dan the Lone Ranger Lett.
Welcome, everybody. This is the last Niigaan and the Lone Ranger podcast before Christmas or holiday season, whatever holiday you and your family celebrate. And we're going to try and cover a lot of ground today and do some different things, some interesting things. And Niigaan, not to echo our opening, but you're good to go for the holiday season.
I'm great. I'm knee deep in snow like everybody else, and just trying to make my way through the holidays. We've got things planned for my family. When you're coming from a complex family that has lots of different parts to it, some of us celebrate the Christmas, some of us don't, and but we'll be usually starting about December 22nd. It's just all family for about a week. Everybody's in, and it's pretty good to be around each other this time of year. And this year is a really special year too, because we're celebrating lots of our family that's passed on. And so we're holding a feast to celebrate our families, our ancestors who have passed on. And this year's been really tough because we've lost so many elders and in our community, Charlie Nelson particularly, and Roger Roulette, and others, Clarence Neepanak. So many elders have left this year to travel to the West, and so we're honoring them with this year's feast. I can't help but was this time is such a celebratory time, but it's also a pretty dark time, I think, in the city, not just because of what's happened with Indigenous women, but You wrote a column that appeared this week in the Free Press about the stabbing of Tyreek Kyer, and just what a tragedy in the downtown library. 4 teenagers have been charged, and these are all people under the age of 18 who hurt this 28-year-old. Last Sunday at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Tyreek Kyer ran into the library. A number of youth followed him, chased after him, and then he met his tragic end in that space. And the library's really been closed since then. It's a real tragedy that's hit the downtown. And I know that you wrote a column about this. What did you say in your column that people might not otherwise know?
Well, I mean, the first thing to acknowledge is that downtowns, the core areas of big urban centers are going through a bit of a crisis right now. It's, all over Western Europe, all over North America. It's a combination of the disruption from the pandemic and mental health, addictions, homelessness, all things combining. And, we've kind of lost the end of the rope on these things. A lot of these macro forces come to play in this one tragic incident. In particular, though, like as I started to talk to people and look at the events that led up to this, and by events I mean decisions that the library made about security, about programming, what we come to is this idea that what happened to this young man is horrible and extremely sad, but it was entirely predictable. Libraries are one of the last, if I can call it this, one of the last non-judgmental public spaces left in the core of cities. The lobbies of private buildings, shopping malls downtown, these places have all been very, very effective at running downtown population out of their facilities. Libraries don't do that. They welcome anybody and everybody, and they often absorb all their problems. And, it's just, we were basically, it's the city and the province, and half-assed attempts to create a safe space in the library, half-assed attempts to deal with the problems outside the library. I mean, really, like the last line of my column is like, what did we think was going to happen with all this half-assed effort? The
space of the library really was the only place for lots of people who are in poverty and people who are experiencing homelessness. When they closed the bathrooms downtown, and they specifically closed the library during the pandemic, you saw drug use exponentially increase as a result. You also saw crime increase, and youth crime specifically. Until 2020, just before the pandemic, crime was at an all-time low for decades and decades before that, particularly amongst youth. And since 2021, youth crime has increased by 27%, and crime has increased almost 25%. Since that time period, just specifically since the pandemic. And so what you've seen is this bounce back where Winnipeg police, the community, many, social service agencies, volunteer-run organizations, were getting a handle on the situation involving crime in the downtown. I think people often don't hear that story about Winnipeg, but because of the pandemic, because of the exponential increase of the reliance on public infrastructure, particularly places like the library, then we've seen this bounce back of crime. And really it hit home with this stabbing, which tells you that city services, provincial services can't just ignore the situation, close bus shelters, for example, take out the glass in bus shelters and think they're fixing the issue of poverty. Yeah. They have to facilitate and support places like the library, which are going to be the ground zero for what are some of these major incidents that are going to happen downtown.
Yeah, the thing that just absolutely enrages me about what's going on down in the at the library. I mean, they have the various attempts have been made to increase the safety and to de-escalate and intervene when an individual or a group of people get involved in some sort of disruption. And, it's embarrassing, quite frankly, the approach that the city has taken and the lack of support from the senior levels of government. So, we go back to 2019. We did, they did metal detecting wands and bag searches at the library. This was their solution. But of course, we picked, the city picked the cheapest, most limited way of going about, metal detection. They had to stop everybody, search bags.
Just ended up cutting off the place for more people, which is the problem in the first place, just like closing the bathrooms.
Yeah. And I mean, there was more expensive machines and technology available that would have allowed people to move more quickly in with less disruption. And we decided, to go the bargain basement route. And so, people reacted. It was awful. Then the pandemic hit. The library was closed. And when the library reopened, they ditched the metal detecting wads and folding tables. And, we've gone through a period of time since then when, the library, the security presence is private security firms. And I don't mean to disparage anybody who makes their living as a private security guard. It's good, honest work. But I mean, really, putting a bunch of mall security guards into an environment like the library has got it you are
with
just
absolutely
begging.
No knowledge, with absolutely no knowledge as to oftentimes who are Indigenous peoples, where did they come from? I mean, we're talking about many times Indigenous peoples, and there has to be crisis intervention workers who are culturally competent, who can handle situations of mental health and addiction. And we may not think of a library as this space, but it is become this place.
Well, and it's funny you should mention crisis intervention workers, because with great fanfare, the city did open up a something called Community Connections. It's a single window resource for people to access help for mental health and addictions, for homelessness, new Canadians that are trying to navigate, their life in a new city, that people can get computer access, they can get references for healthcare, food security. I mean, it's a good idea. It's also, really the standard in big urban library systems. However, here's the catch. Okay, so this is great. So the federal government gave the city some money. The city gave the library system this money, and they created the space. And then they told the library system that they had to pay out of their budget for the social workers, crisis intervention staff, to populate this Community Connections. And, let's face it, the library system is not getting the same support, let's say, as the Winnipeg Police Service. So they have a pretty lean budget. So they had to take out of their library budget, and librarians who really have, their librarians are great people, as you well know. I have a deep appreciation for librarians, but they're not trained for this kind of work. Well, they're staffing Community Connections. So it's so lean and ridiculously cheap approach means that the crisis intervention workers are not available for all the hours that the downtown branch of the library is open. So it's, again, it's you take a cheap ass approach, you get a bad result. What did they think was going to happen?
Yeah, exactly. And the situation, unfortunately, is increasing and is getting increasingly more dangerous. There's also been another situation in a hotel near just down Portage Avenue that just had a violent incident that just happened. I mean, there is a ongoing situation within the city, and I'm the first person to say that these stories are often overblown, but even I'm saying that there is a serious situation happening in the city that can't just involve more metal detectors and police officers. It's got to involve people who are doing frontline work, who can assist. Many of those are already volunteer organizations doing things for peanuts, and they have to be able to fund. The city has to be able to fund better agencies. The province has to fund better agencies to be able to do this work more effectively than simply just throwing people into jail.
For sure. I think The trouble in Winnipeg, though, however, is not the only trouble that landed on our radar screen this week.
I was about to say, speaking of jail.
Speaking of jail, that's right. This week, one of our favorite stories, Niigaan and I, one of our favorite stories, took a quantum leap forward in the melodrama, on the melodrama scale, when the special committee of the U.S. Congress that's been looking into the January 6th insurrection recommended criminal charges against former U.S. President Donald Trump, for potential charges. These are recommendations to the Justice Department, who prosecute such things. There's no guarantee that this will happen. It's also important to understand, too, that in the transition that's going to take place in January, where Republicans are going to regain control
January
of the House.
3rd. Yeah, January 3rd.
Yeah, that this was a bipartisan committee. There are Republicans supporting the notion of charges, but that there's going to be some vigorous efforts made by Republicans to roll this thing back, put the genie back in the bottle. Still, it's pretty fascinating to see a bipartisan committee seek to hold a former president of the United States criminally liable for the events of January the 6th.
Only since Nixon has this happened. But when the difference is, of course, is when Nixon was recommended for criminal charges, that was 100% support from all parties. And this, of course, difference is that I'll give, it can be described in a simple way. Mike Pence, as soon as the results for the January 6th hearings came out this week, Mike Pence came out to say, this might not be criminal liable. It's irresponsible, as he said. Now we have to remember that Mike Pence was one of the individuals who the January 6th protesters, I saw a video just this morning, in fact, there was a chant going during the January 6th insurrection, hang Mike Pence. He was rushed out of the Capitol to a secret location that even the president wasn't aware of where he was, which tells you a lot of the situation that even Mike Pence thought about when it came to his own safety. Mm-hmm. This, of course, these recommendations don't come with a lot of teeth. It's the Department of Justice who has appointed a special prosecutor to investigate whether they can lay charges on the president. But I mean, these 4 charges are very serious, are conspiracy to defraud the United States, obstruction of an official proceeding, conspiracy to make false statements, and inciting an insurrection. I mean, like any of the 4 of these, pick and choose.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't the only legal trouble facing Donald Trump. I mean, there's still potential criminal charges relating to his absconding with classified documents and refusing to turn them over, and concerns that he still may be in possession of sensitive and classified materials. I mean, this is a seminal, maybe in the history of the world's democracies too, like one of the most historic tests of democratic institutions. Whether or not a government, broadly speaking, which includes some very diametrically opposed political views, whether they can come together and agree that certain behavior, even by the chief executive, is completely unacceptable. I mean, I will say, and we've talked about this before, but in the midterm elections, American democratic institutions proved remarkably resilient, and voters, seemed to demonstrate a new level of cognizance and common sense that a lot of people thought they might not. But man, oh man, it is going to be some sort of test of the resilience and the commitment that people in government have to the integrity of government.
Yeah, I was reminded this week on how many people, I mean, wherever you stand in the political spectrum, Republican, Democrat, or, whatever else there is in the United States, uh, where that it took a number of people to stand up against what was a concerted effort by the former president to overturn the democracy, which now has been accused that it was a plan of action with several different layers and several different parts to, the January 6th insurrection was only one part of that plan to get people to overturn a justifiable election. And one of those things, of course, that's come out during the preliminary report, we won't know the full report till more information comes out. But the preliminary report says that there was also a plan to put in false electors to replace those electors from states which had dutiful elections. And so what you've seen also is states opening up investigations on the former president, particularly Georgia, and that Georgia also has a criminal proceeding underway, or a potential investigation into criminal proceedings underway on Trump. And we'll certainly see how this story is going to lay out. I mean, Trump issued a statement immediately following the January 6th findings to say, go ahead. Or, every time you bring something against me, I become stronger. And, matching his what is that, an NFT card that he released with him looking like he's wearing a Superman outfit or whatever else that he's.
Well, yeah, there's one of him face to face with a lion too, which I think is like criminal metaphor abuse. But anyways, that poor lion. The adamancy of this guy to not just paint the January 6th hearings as partisan, as a Democrat or whatever else he wants to pose it as, even though it's not, but that he wants to paint this as some kind of witch hunt against his legacy. The best part that I found during the January 6th findings was that he released a statement, or that he, people who testified against him, I think it was Hope Hicks, who testified to say that he told her that if he didn't get reelected, his legacy would be gone forever. And that gave me a moment of self-awareness that we often don't see with Trump. That kind of gave me some pleasure. Yeah, well, and I think it also represents the way that narcissists often, people with a pathological absence of self-awareness don't realize that there are many different ways that you can earn a legacy. And to tell you the truth, he didn't win the election. I don't really think that he has to worry about having no legacy. I think he has to worry about the kind of legacy that he has.
And with that brings us to the holidays.
Back to the holidays. That's right. Back to the holidays, and but also another edition of the Storytellers, and a very special and I think ambitious feature interview that is kind of holiday themed, because a lot of us, what we do is we go to see movies over the holidays. And so we're going to talk about one of the big holiday blockbusters, but we're also going to talk about the proliferation of Indigenous-made, Indigenous-themed television and movies, and try to figure out if, whether it's okay to like these. Is it okay to say that?
or are things getting better?
Things getting better? That's a better way.
I think we all want to ask that question, considering we'll be discussing the new Avatar movie. Are things really getting better?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeanette, and I'm a psychiatric nurse, a community mental health worker, and the very proud mother of Niigaan. And this is the Storytellers. I've been asked to tell a story of a proud holiday mum, but this story might also embarrass Niigaan just a little bit. As a single mum in the 1980s, I was hired to work in Manitoba's North Interlake as a community mental health worker in Ashern, Manitoba. Ashern's a small town of about 300 people that also services several First Nations communities who come to the town to shop, work, and attend school. Many of these kids, therefore, attended school with my children and, of course, Niigaan, who was attending grade 6 at the Ashern Central School. For a northern Manitoba town, Ashern was pretty interesting because nearly every single person either worked with or was related to Indigenous peoples. This made for some interesting cross-cultural nights at the hockey rink, the community hall talent nights, or in the school. Many things I've seen today called reconciliation were already happening in the years we lived in Ashern, and I'm very proud that my children are part of them in that community. Each year, the school put on a Christmas pageant. When Niigaan was in grade 6, at age 11 in 1987, he was selected to be a shepherd, which required him to learn songs such as We Three Kings, Silent Night, and sitting with 100 or so other kids on the stage surrounding a reenactment of the manger scene when baby Jesus was born. Remember, this was 1987, and these kinds of events were still part of the public school system. Niigaan came home and asked me to find him a brown towel and a bathrobe for his costume. This was what all the students were asked to wear as to be a shepherd on the stage. I know, this is pretty bad stereotypes, but as a mum, I found him all the stuff and watched him for weeks practicing around the house, singing Christmas songs morning, noon, and night, getting ready for this pageant. The teachers at Ashern, whether they knew it or not, were actually pretty interesting too. For the scene of Joseph and Mary in the manger, they picked a kid from the local Ojibwe reserve to play the role of Joseph and a non-Indigenous girl from town to play the role of Mary. Thinking back on this was pretty radical. An interracial couple being the parents of Jesus. No one thought much about it, but now that I think about it, it was just a part of living in Ashern. Finally, the big night came. Niigaan was very excited as I dropped him off for the evening's Christmas pageant. My daughter and I went and sat in the school gym and waited with my camera like all the other parents for the night to begin. When the curtain opened, I looked for my Niigaan to see where he was sitting on stage with all the other kids, but couldn't find him anywheres. He was nowhere to be found. About halfway through the version of We Three Kings, just as the kings were arriving to give presents to the baby Jesus, I noticed who was sitting by Mary. It was Niigaan. Apparently the student from the First Nations had car trouble and couldn't make it to town to play his part. So the teachers asked Niigaan to fill in as Joseph for the night. So there my boy was, right in the middle of it all, the Indigenous father of Jesus. Good thing Joseph had no dialogue, but Niigaan was a little disappointed he never got to sing after all that practicing. Of course, this then made me the grandmother of this interracial Jesus, but I'll leave others to consider how interesting that is. And that's my story of how my boy became the Ojibwe father of Jesus. Happy holidays to everyone.
We have a very special guest on the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast, making us a trio on the trail. We have my good friend Theodore C. Van Alst Jr., or Theo, as everybody knows him. Mm-hmm. And some of you, if you don't know who Theo is, you will certainly get to. He is a transport to the United States, but he actually has family from Manitoba. He's professor and chair of Indigenous Nation Studies and director of the School of Gender, Race, and Nations at Portland State University. He's written poetry, books like Sacred Smokes, and he's got a new book that's just out, Sacred City, both of them with the University of New Mexico Press. Tons of writings on film, media, TV, and other than that, I'll just say he is very luckily a friend of mine.
Same.
I'm not sure
stop gushing.
Part of your bio.
No, there's no gushing on the podcast, man. Try and keep it
or else I wouldn't be up this early. So we're friends.
Welcome to the Niigaan and Lone Ranger podcast, Theo.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's really It's really cool to be here. A big part of this is my collecting my $8.50 US from you, since you made me go watch Avatar yesterday afternoon. So that's going to be
Expensive.
I'll send you the bill at the end. I'll probably invoice on screen. So, yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm also an enrolled member of Mackinac Bands of Chippewa and Ottawa Indians. I want to put that out there and just say, man, I'm going to share some things about Avatar. I think we've got a multi-part show today, so we'll kick it off with that while it's still fresh in my mind.
When Dan and I were talking this week about what show to talk about, and we wanted to. Dan's here too. Dan, say hello.
Hey, yeah, that was the if the ethereal other voice off in the making fun. So yeah, I'm here.
So when we were talking about putting the show together this week, we were sort of thinking holiday. We were thinking, what should we be talking about? Because in Manitoba right now, things are a bit on the downside. We've got some violent crime that's happening in the city, and but at the same time, it's the holidays. We wanted to talk about maybe a film that people would see over the holidays. So I thought there's no one really better to talk about than my favorite film critic, Theo, to discuss the latest Avatar movie, James Cameron's blockbuster. I was about to say Blackbuster, but blockbuster. Avatar 2, The Way of Water, just came out. You and I both saw it last night. Dan said he couldn't bring himself to see it. He hated the first one so much.
No, it wasn't about the $8.50, man. Like I would have, and sometimes going to see a movie that's bad is like good, right? Like it's so bad, it's good. Yeah. I don't get it. I don't get the Avatar thing, but that's not an informed position. That's just a, popcorn position.
Our thoroughly informed position. Clearly, it is popular. $134 million opening box office weekend. It's on track. It matched the Batman in terms of this year's blockbuster. I think it's number 7 or 8 on the year's highest grossing films. But Theo, maybe give me a quick take on what I will call Dances with Wolves Part 2, because do you remember that scene where Lieutenant Dunbar in Dances with Wolves way back in the 1990s, where he is sort of escapes from his people, he's with another group of people, and then the cavalry show up again, and he runs off into the wilderness, and we never quite know what happens to him? Well, this film picks up exactly where that leaves off. He goes off. Sully, or his name is Jake Sully, takes off, goes off to live with another group of Indigenous peoples. Of course, he is not an Indigenous person. He is an American who's been transported into an Avatar body. But then he goes off and lives with basically the Māori people, the water Indigenous people who have face tattoos exactly like the Māori. And then we find out kind of what happens to him. And there's a full Titanic scene almost taken directly. All we were missing was the door and Leonardo DiCaprio.
Seriously. I mean, there's a little Titanic with some MMA and wrestling in there. There's a reference to Apocalypse Now in there. There's a couple of reference. And the film, I don't even know where to start. I can say the first one. So the last time I talked about Avatar was to sort of ruin it at the Yale Divinity School when it came out, and I just looked up. It was called Last of the Na'vi, All American Avatar, and I think to sort of maybe to answer your question a little bit, Dan, I think what's happening is this sort of it's a big settler fantasy. This movie starts with Last of the Mohicans, and I'll just run it down really quick. In Last of the Mohicans, the guy spends a lifetime to become the best native, right? And they accelerate that. So in Niigaan's favorite film, Dances with Wolves, he spends his summer vacation to become the best native there is. So Avatar is actually the laziest of all the Last of the Mohicans because they just drop him in the body. He doesn't even have to do any work, right? He struggles a little bit with the language, but he has all of the sort of tools that he needs to be the best native. And that's the arc of the film. It's a fantasy film through and through.
and he the same, similar stories to the first Avatar. He basically saves Indigenous peoples yet again. Although in this one, I actually found it very interesting. And spoiler alert to everybody that if you don't want to hear about what's happening in the end, you might want to stop the podcast here and come back to it to hear our analysis. But in this one, it's so interesting because if you remember in the first Avatar, he saved the planet from basically white people. He called them sky people or human beings or whatever, but they're basically white people.
Sky people, yeah.
And in this film, it really breaks it down to he saves his family as opposed to the people, which generally get screwed because he brought the war to those people. So it's this funny sort of interesting breakdown into the nuclear American dream that it's now we've got this pioneer family that he's now sort of created. And it really is, as you said, a settler fantasy in this story, because he's no longer saving people. He's now saving sort of his nuclear family that he's created with an adoptee of another human alien creation. Who, by the way, is the best Indigenous of all, because Indigenous peoples can't download into exactly. Theo just pointed at a T-shirt he's wearing that says half-breed. When you're a half-breed, you're the most perfect of all, aren't you? Right? I mean, and so it is the perfect narrative of American exceptionalism to say that you can go to a land, take it over, and then you don't need the Indigenous peoples anymore because you've replaced them.
Yeah. And one of the things I noticed too, because we talk about some of the Hollywood references, that the half-breeds get really dragged in this film. There's a lot of crucial bad things that happen due to half-breeds, which is a very 1920s, 1930s thing. I don't know if you recall, even up through like the original Lone Ranger, the guy who betrays the Lone Ranger is a half-breed. Half-breeds always can't be trusted by either side. When the kids get there, they're sort of outsiders. They call them half-breeds. There's a very interesting piece that sort of gets opened up there. And I talked to some folks, some born and raised res folks who had seen the film, and one of them had mentioned that it was really interesting what they did with the half-breed thing, that they thought that they could explore that even more, right? And and I agree, but the thing that you mentioned was the thing that they liked about the movie was that it was focused on family, that there was very much like you had some affinity with the characters because it was really about family, which is really important. The one thing that this person said about the film, which they said, it's just, and I agree, it is relentlessly unfunny. There is no humor in this thing at all. He goes, if they had some Indians writing in there, there'd be some jokes, because, and he's right, because this film, it's a grind. It's a real grind. And I'll give you my quick assessment, Niigaan. I know you want to say something here, but this is like a really unedited Discovery Channel film with some hyper violent moments against Indigenous people. The Indigenous pain in this is super deep and exploitative. There's a long, and spoiler alert, so mute your stuff. There's a long, really way too long, drawn out murder of a cetacean relative and her child through the water that just goes on and on and on. And is really, it's really disturbingly violent. So it moves between a Discovery Channel about the ocean, it has Cameron's vibe with the deep and all that and the abyss and all that kind of stuff. But then these hyper violent moments.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Theo, like you guys mentioned how, settler fantasy and the, connection to other films that are treatments or mistreatments of the Indigenous narrative. But I'm wondering as well, too, like, is this a corollary? Like, is it an extension of the white guy or girl goes to inner city school, goes to foreign country, and saves them from themselves kind of film that, like, I mean, I'd like to think they make fewer of them in Hollywood now, but it kind of creeps back in from time to time. Are there some filmatic connections between those types of films?
Well, I mean, Tom Cruise Last Samurai is the one that really comes.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Theo.
Oh no, I was going to say there's really only one kind of instance where they come in from the outside, where one of the kids, right, one of the half-breed kids, actually makes relatives with someone who had been considered an outsider for a long time, who had been shunned from the community, and so they sort of make this bridge. But there isn't sort of the teaching savior moments in that way. It's much more sort of meta global in its saviorism.
The first 30 minutes of the film is basically a recap of the first film. And then you find out that he has a family and some kids and so on. And then the film doubles down. Like, all the criticism James Cameron got, and even went to the Indigenous peoples of Alberta, I think Blackfoot peoples, and spent some time with him after Avatar. And he said, "Oh, I'm going to make sure the next one is better," and all this kind of stuff. And that was like, 150 years ago or whenever that was. And so in this one, it doubles down. I mean, the commanding officer for the humans, when they arrive on the planet again, which they've come back after 10 years, basically with revenge, is they're going to take the whole planet now, and they're going to industrialize the whole thing. And the search is really driven for the Fountain of Youth, which is like right out of Pilgrim narratives, going back to the 15th century, that when the first discovery of North America was basically that there'd be a fountain of youth here, and there is a fountain of youth on this planet. I won't tell people where it is because I won't spoil everything, but I will say that the fountain of youth is on this planet, and literally, like, it's like a 15th century narrative gone amok.
Yeah. I agree. There's a lot of just settler fantasy and narrative in here. It reads it's kind of like in parts like a Greenpeace propaganda. It's very anti-whaling. So there's like 17th, 18th century narratives in there as well. There's even there's a Moby Dick reference in there. You'll get it. You'll see it when it happens. It's kind of wild. And
just watch for the Titanic reference. We don't want to spend all the time on Avatar, but I'm sure people will just rush to the theaters now.
Well, the thing is you mentioned, Dan, like, this is a movie that families will go see. Look, if you need your kid to take a nap, go to this film, because it's like 90 minutes too long, right? And they're gonna peace out right in the middle of the big giant sea anemone part. Your kids are gonna pass out. So bring blankets and snacks, because this is like an epic undertaking. It's a day trip.
3.5 hour film. Yeah. We want to get to talking about some of the more recent developments in film and TV too, which you've talked and written a lot about. Everybody's talking about Reservation Dogs, and Taika Waititi worked with some indigenous peoples, notably, people in Oklahoma, to develop this incredible blockbuster series that's taken the online community by storm. Can you talk a little bit about Reservation Dogs and just the growth of an industry that's being led now by Indigenous filmmakers and TV makers?
Yeah, and that's a good point to bring, and I think you have to look at some of this stuff. It seems like, oh yeah, all of a sudden everybody's talking about, but in actuality, that Sundance program that Taika Waititi and Sterling Harjo and they all came out, that's over 20 years old, right? So it's a long time in the making to get here. But I think, with artistic production, timing is everything, right? How many lost artists and ignored people are there? And I think there's something in the world right now. There's sort of a confluence of a demand for authenticity, the ability to sort of check people, to check things. And I think the stories and everything and the writing that's being told in a show like Reservation Dogs has a lot of resonance in the world, right? People are looking for what's authentic, what's, what is something that's universal I can respond to. And I think a broader audience is finding things within this show, and the writing is excellent. The production is excellent, right? The tales they're telling are fantastic. And because it's all Indigenous-led, it has a different vibe. It's funny. It's about the ancestors. It's about the day-to-day grind. It's about dreams. It's about all of these things that I think don't always come along. And they've managed to do that in this show in really special and spectacular ways. And there, you watch this show, there are episodes that'll make you cry for sure, and there are things in there that'll make you cry from laughing too. So everything is encased in there. It's really pretty wonderful in a lot of ways.
I mean, you mentioned the word authentic, and I mean, I think that, for a non-Indigenous audience, there's always this lingering idea in the back when you're watching Dark Winds or Reservation Dogs or Crave. Apple has just pushed out Three Pines, which interestingly, it's a co-Canadian production based on a really popular series of books where the producers of the film, that are not all Indigenous, so like a lot of the writers and producers are, but they've actually rewritten characters in the original novels to be Indigenous, which is like turning the tap in the other direction, is kind of an interesting tribute. But but you would say, back to Reservation Dogs, like that it is authentic. I very rarely have watched a show that I think combines like this deeply visceral pathos with humor, and, in discussing like the worst and the best experiences of life on a reservation. But for those of us who are not Indigenous, you would say this show's been embraced as an authentic expression.
Yeah, I mean, if you check the sort of social media criticisms and stuff of it, and it's not just this wonderful, hermetically sealed, fantastic production. There are issues, that have been discussed here and there, but I think that the show does that thing in terms of authenticity, where you have all of that that's enrolled in that's encapsulated rather in the show. And when you talk about humor, you're talking about survivor's humor, you're talking about gallows humor, you're talking about all those things, that coping mechanisms and all of those things. And I tell my students, we talk about the humor piece, I go back to the great Alan King, right? A great sort of Borscht Belt Jewish comedian back in the day. And he was like on Johnny Carson, and Johnny just said to him, because it was then, he's like, why are there so many Jewish comedians? Why are you so funny? And Alan King looks at me and goes, so you don't kill the rest of us, right? So there's this sort of humor in this, and this is like 20 years after the Holocaust, right? So he's trying to sort of process this thing, and I think that's what you do, And I'm would always crack jokes when I was an undergrad and stuff, and I had this asshole sociology professor is like, humor is just poor man's vodka. I'm like, dude, you are something else, man.
You're missing the point.
Yeah, exactly. So I think if you read, there's always humor, and that's what I meant about the Avatar. There's just no humor. It's totally non-Indigenous. It's just like, this is, there are plenty of moments, and Niigaan, you saw it, where you could have had some really bomber jokes going on.
Yeah, there's no.
You think James Cameron would take notes at this point, or
he better?
I think James Cameron was too obsessed with his vision, which I think is now tipped, because now he says that it may not be a 5-film series, but might be a 3-film series. The Canadian version of Reservation Dogs is out now, and I don't know if you've seen it because you're on the other side of the medicine line there, but it's by a Manitoba comedian, First Nations comedian called Paul Robuslakis. He has got a show called Acting Good. It's on CTV, which is the major private network here in the country. It's been universally sort of beloved. It's about his time on his reserve. I think it's a fictional reserve, but it's based on his life growing up in northern Manitoba. What is it about TV specifically that is leading to a lot of really strong Indigenous-run narratives? We're seeing a little bit that in film, but we're seeing it really in TV.
When I talk about like novels or film, my book, short stories, pieces like that are like television. I write television. I don't write like epic films. I write sort of these consumable moments. You spend 20 minutes, a half hour with a story or with an episode, you can do the thing. And I don't think people always have the wherewithal to sit down and watch films. And so television, though not necessarily cheaper than films, is a way to tell a story arcs, evolving characters. I think there's a lot that you can do. I'm a big proponent of the short and of episodic television. I think you can do some really good and interesting things, and you can change things up week to week. And so I think and because television is streamable, because you can watch an episode at lunch, or you can keep up with it in ways that are much easier than to sit down and watch a film. So I think television, and because you usually have more writers in the room, there's just a lot more possibility for creativity in television.
I'm wondering if the sheer amount and the obviously the money people in TV and movies they're coming up with the money to make these shows. I mean, they see the commercial benefit as well as the cultural value. But I thought like one of the interesting sub narratives to the Dark Winds. It's a thriller detective novel that takes place on a Navajo nation in New Mexico, and it's a Robert Redford executive produced show. But just about all the major hands-on people for the production were Indigenous, but it kind of reminded me that like we, perhaps there's been so much success that we're now also learning that there's no one unified, homogenized Indigenous, TV and movie. So one of the sub narratives of Dark Winds is, it's a Navajo nation. None of the actors were Navajo, so of course they did speak Dene, during the show, and then Navajo elders and protectors of culture came out and said, yeah, that was a really good effort, but you people are not convincing as members of the Navajo Nation. And it's I guess suppose that in a way that we're starting to learn about there is no homogenous Indigenous culture, that's also a positive perhaps that's coming out of this.
Yeah, it's not a monolith, right? People are starting to learn that. Some folks are starting to learn that the hard way. I think too, though, people are making arguments. Well, it's acting. I mean, it's a fictional character, right? I think if you say, yeah, specifically, this is a Dene person, then you want to get as close to that as possible. And if you can cast a Dene actor who can do that job, then you should do that thing. I think about Reservation Dogs. I think about Miss Alexis, right? Or Miss Alexis. She's from Alexis First Nations, right? And the Willie Jack character in there is from up north, right? And I think Cheese is from Oklahoma. There people are from all over the place. And it brings me back to the first Smoke Signals, and people are like, that's actually not an American film. That's actually a First Nations film. Everybody in it is from up north, right? So you have that's sort of swirling around. That's a really good point, Dan, is that like how deeply authentic does a person have to be from that specific nation to play that specific role, right? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think it's evolving, and I think it's good that there's room to sort of, peel that back and have a closer look at what it is that's trying to be, they're trying to do here.
Yeah, I think when you talk about the 20 years or decades long struggle to kind of produce a new generation of Indigenous filmmakers, this is a great problem to have compared to where things were 20 years ago.
I haven't been really surprised by the retelling by Indigenous filmmakers and TV makers of history, of in many ways correcting history. I mean, I'm thinking of Richard Wagame's, Indian Horse, sort of correcting the experiences of residential school, talking about the kind of dynamism of a person who goes to residential school, but then can still, could become the world's greatest hockey player and then struggle with these different demons that Richard himself dealt with during that film, the novel, then a film. But you also see this kind of trend in futurism in Indigenous films and TV that I think is the most exciting elements. And I'm thinking about Blood Quantum as this Indigenous zombie film that people might have been able to download on their TVs. I don't think it had a theatrical release because it was probably released either pre-pandemic or during the pandemic. But Blood Quantum is this really interesting narrative, which is about colonization, but it's also about the future. And it's also about, basically a zombie plague has corrupted the world, and the only immune people are Indigenous people. And they don't play along much with blood quantum per se as to talking about who's half-breed, who's not. This is more about kinship, and it's about the creation of a community in the apocalypse of the destruction of a universe, which is very much talking about a history, but it's also talking about a future and how do we create a future. And I think that's probably the most exciting thing. And maybe it's the most marketable thing too, because I've often said Indigenous knowledge is what's going to save the world. Not capitalism, certainly not elements of Christianity. It's going to be Indigenous sustainability and reciprocity that will probably save the world. You think about the global climate change collapse and so on. Do you see the same thing in kind of a future looking toward a futuristic looking in the film and TV?
I think some of those things are gonna come forward. I'm thinking of different projects, and I'm thinking of what folks are writing. We just got we're going to have a release next year. We with the co-editor of mine, Shane Hawk, we put together a really I think special collection of Indigenous dark fiction, and some of that is futuristic, and some of it deals with the past. And I'm excited. It has folks from both sides of the line. It has I don't know if I can name the authors, but it's going to be a big book. And I think about what people are writing about in there. And I think about having talked to students, like Native Lit is post-apocalyptic literature. This is all futuristic. We're all sort of writing out of the ashes of what's happened over the last 500 years. I think of Danny Goulet's Wakening, right? One of the earliest sort of cool films that I remember seeing. I don't know if you know that film. It's like a kind of a post-apocalyptic Montreal, and there's a Witiko in a movie theater that lives in a movie theater. You can get it online. It's like it's a short. Again, I like short films, but that film I think was pretty early on, indicating what was happening. And I think you're right. I think there's two tracks. There's what's the here and now, and what there's going to be, and maybe that's a key difference. Is a lot of native film that's non-native authored or non-Indigenous made looks at the past all of the time and doesn't imagine us in the future. And in order to be in the future, we have to imagine ourselves there. And that's, I think, a key difference.
And for those of you that don't know what a Witiko is it's a traditional character in Cree and Anishinaabe traditions that consumes. It's basically a cannibalistic figure, but it's also a creator being, because it's someone that doesn't just destroy, but also encourages you to create or to choose a path of kinship and to choose a path of family, of community. And so interesting that it lives in a film, in a theater, in that it is the theater, it is the place that we are most often misrepresented and destroyed, because it's so full of pop culture. It influences the most amount of people, probably more than government and policy, is film, movie, books, novels. And so, I got an interesting tweet this week. The very first one that I've gotten, Dan said he's gotten a couple of them, but the very first one that I've gotten, where somebody said, "Hey, the name of your podcast is very racist." And I was like, no, it's a reimagining. It's a repossession. We're trying to remake a narrative that has been highly destructive of Indigenous peoples in the past, particularly in film and TV and radio. And we're redoing it. We're showing that it can be full of humor and full of life and full of interesting elements. And I think putting a Witiko in a theater is the perfect metaphor.
Nice. And you can tell that person who tweeted at you to watch the pilot of The Lone Ranger, because The Lone Ranger is actually a creation of Tonto's. I taught this. I'm getting the yes from Dan. I have taught this thing in class and showed it to students. They're like, whoa, the original Tonto is a pretty transgressive dude. And he's like, maybe you should wear this mask. Maybe you should call yourself the Lone Ranger. It's really good. He's totally created by Tonto. So there's that.
Yeah. Well, we focus group the name in our various communities, and but also I had to do like a lot of deep research to make sure the Lone Ranger hadn't been canceled. But going back to our first episode, we talked about there's also the code of conduct that the Lone Ranger lives by, and then there was also the original creators had whenever they licensed it, because it started as a radio serial, right, for film and TV, they had a list of rules that the Lone Ranger could never kill anybody. That the enemies of the Lone Ranger that he was pursuing would always have to be white. It couldn't be a racialized group. And this is going back to the 1930s. That put my mind at ease a little bit about adopting the reimagined character of the Lone Ranger. So,
and I can add a little too, because I was talking about it in class, and I have some senior folks who take classes. And I was talking about, I don't know what happened. This sort of, there's this great transgressive pilot, and then he kind of devolves into this sidekick character, blah, blah, blah. And this woman in the back was like, I don't know what you're talking about. He was never a sidekick. He was, and I was like, well, have you seen that? She goes, I'm talking about the radio show. And so this woman, she grew up.
Okay,
with the radio
props.
show.
Yeah.
She's like, yeah, the radio show is even better for Tano. So yeah, definitely.
I want to say a big miigwech to you, my Anishinaabe brother, Theo, and all the work that you do in film and TV. I also have to come back to Manitoba.
Always happy to visit. And yeah, definitely, brother. Anytime.
Yeah, and I'll just add 2 notes to thanks. Number one, thanks to both of you, because now I don't have to see the Avatar sequel. It's dead to me now, and I feel good about that. And then the second one is my wife and I can thoroughly enjoy Reservation Dogs with the understanding that it's a good thing, which isn't always hard or isn't always easy for folks like me to figure out. But I really appreciate your insight into that.
Absolutely. I think the one thing I would say again about something like Reservation Dogs, a Native made thing in that regard, is that there's stuff that like Native folks are instantly going to key in on, right? Like with the owl, like that was just hilarious, man. I was on the ground. And so it reminds me, it's a 2-track narrative. And if you have kids, this from going to Pixar movies. You're like, there are 2 different movies playing here, right? There's the one for the kids, and then there's the one for the adults. And I think in a thing like Reservation Dogs, there's definitely, the overculture might get some of this stuff, but it's definitely made for Native audiences. And that resonates with folks like in really deep ways.
Well, let's hold that as a model for our podcast, to a double narrative. Big miigwech to you, Theo. Thanks so much for being on the podcast. We appreciate it so much, and for your generosity of your time.
Gee, miigwech, bro.
Big thanks to all of the crew at CJNU and Adam, our producer. Of course, all of our friends and our colleagues at the Winnipeg Free Press who continue to support the podcast. And I hope that you have a great holiday this week. It's a big time for family and for community. I hope that you all spend that. Dan, you too.
Thank you, brother. I think it's all worked out better than we could have even hoped for.
We'll see you in the next episode of Niigaan the Lone Ranger.